Welcome to Beneath the Desert Stars, a story of sacrifice, love, and redemption. What happens when a billionaire driven by duty crosses paths with a single mother willing to risk everything for her child? As secrets unravel and hearts collide, they must navigate a journey neither of them expected. But here's the question. Can two lives bound by a contract turn into something real, or will the truth tear them apart? Stay tuned to uncover the twist that will leave you breathless. Cold wind seeped through the cracks of Lila's small apartment window. She glanced around at the worn-out furniture and the scattered, modest toys belonging to her son, On. Her mind raced. Overdue bills, unpaid rent, and the haunting memory of last night when On had gone to bed hungry weighed heavily on her. "I need a solution," she whispered to herself, clutching an eviction notice in her trembling hands. She couldn't accept this as On's life. He deserved so much more. On the table, a brightly colored flyer caught her attention. Private auction, changing lives, guaranteed reward. It was something she'd never have considered in the past, but tonight, hope outweighed her pride. Reluctantly, she picked up the phone and scheduled an appointment. As On slept, Lila sat beside his bed, running her fingers through his soft hair. "This is for you," she murmured, a promise made in silence. No matter what, she would do whatever it took to secure his future. The grand hall gleamed under the glow of opulent chandeliers. Lila stepped inside, her heart pounding as the sight of extravagance clashed with the crushing weight of her decision. Women lined up, dressed to accentuate their beauty, their nervous energy palpable. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but forced herself to keep her gaze steady. The announcer called her name. Lot number 23. Lila drew a shaky breath and climbed the stage, her legs trembling. The bright spotlight blinded her momentarily, and the murmurs from the crowd felt like a wave of judgment. "A truly exotic beauty," the host declared, his words making her feel even more objectified. $1 million. A deep, commanding voice cut through the room. Silence fell as everyone turned toward the back row. Kareem Alft, a man with striking features and an aura of power, raised his hand calmly. "Sold," the announcer proclaimed. Lila felt her knees buckle, but she kept her composure as she stepped off the stage. Kareem approached her, his sharp gaze unreadable. "We need to discuss the terms," he said, his tone firm. He extended a hand to lead her to a private room. Lila nodded, knowing her life was about to change forever. The private room was a stark contrast to the grandeur of the auction hall. It was furnished with sleek, modern decor, every surface polished to perfection. Lila sat in a plush armchair, her fingers trembling as she clutched her bag. Across from her, Kareem Alf stood by a table, flipping through a file. Without preamble, he placed a document in front of her. "This is the agreement," he began, his voice calm but devoid of warmth. "You will stay at my estate. In return, you'll bear my child. Once the child is born, you'll leave, and I'll provide financial compensation, $1 million. Lila's breath caught. She knew this would be part of the arrangement, but hearing it laid out so plainly made her stomach churn. "You want me to abandon my child?" she asked, her voice trembling. Kareem's dark eyes locked on hers. "It's non-negotiable," he replied. "I need an heir. You will have no responsibilities beyond bringing the child into the world." Tears threatened to spill, but Lila forced herself to remain composed. She thought of On, of his small, trusting face. This money would secure his future. With trembling hands, she signed the contract, each stroke of the pen feeling like a blow to her heart. Kareem took the document without a word. "You'll be picked up tomorrow morning," he said, turning to leave. Alone in the room, Lila stared at her signature, a hollow ache settling in her chest. The next morning, a sleek limousine pulled up in front of Lila's modest apartment. She hugged On tightly, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "Mommy has to go for a little while, sweetheart," she said, fighting back tears. "But I'll be back soon, okay?" On nodded, his small arms wrapping around her neck. "I love you, Mommy," he whispered, Lila swallowed the lump in her throat and climbed into the limousine. The ride was silent, the scenery shifting from crowded city streets to vast stretches of desert. As they neared the estate, the sight of the mansion left her breathless. Tall iron gates opened to reveal manicured gardens and a sprawling home that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. Lila felt a wave of unease as the car came to a stop. Kareem waited at the entrance, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. "Welcome," he said curtly. "Amira, the housekeeper, will show you to your room and explain the rules." Amira, a kind-looking woman in her late 50s, smiled warmly as she approached. "Come with me, dear," she said. The room prepared for Lila was opulent, with soft linens and elegant decor, a stark contrast to her life back home. But despite its beauty, it felt cold, impersonal. As Amira left, Lila stood by the window, gazing at the desert stretching into the horizon. She had made her choice, but the weight of it was heavier than she could bear. The mansion was a study in silence. Every corner spoke of wealth and perfection, yet it felt devoid of life. As Lila settled into her routine, she rarely saw Kareem. He spent most of his time in his study or away on business. One evening, curiosity got the better of her. Wandering through the mansion, she stumbled upon a room filled with ornate furniture and a piano. On a nearby shelf, framed photographs caught her eye. Pictures of a younger Kareem with a woman she assumed was his mother. Amira found her there and hesitated before speaking. "That was his mother's favorite room," she said softly. "What happened to her?" Lila asked. Amira sighed. "She passed when Kareem was young. His father became very strict after that, focused only on business. Kareem grew up carrying responsibilities that would break most men." Lila absorbed this revelation. It explained Kareem's cold demeanor, but she couldn't shake the feeling that beneath his rigid exterior, there was more to him. She left the room, her thoughts lingering on the man who now held her fate in his hands. Days at the mansion blurred together. Lila spent her time walking through the vast gardens or reading in her room. Though the staff were polite, she felt like an outsider, a guest in a life that wasn't hers. Her interactions with Kareem remained minimal. He would occasionally check in, his questions practical and to the point. "Are you comfortable? Do you need anything?" he'd ask, his tone detached. "I'm fine," she would reply, though it was far from the truth. The ache of being away from on gnawed at her, and the reality of her situation weighed heavily. One afternoon, she ventured into the gardens, drawn to the serenity of the place. She found Kareem there, tending to a delicate plant. He didn't acknowledge her immediately, his focus entirely on the task at hand. "Do you always do this yourself?" she asked, breaking the silence. He glanced at her briefly. "Some things require a personal touch," he replied, his tone soft but guarded. Lila saw a flicker of vulnerability in his expression, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. She returned to her room that evening, more intrigued than ever by the man who seemed both unyielding and deeply human. Lila sat on the edge of her bed, holding a small photograph of On she had managed to hide in her luggage. His bright smile brought both comfort and pain. She longed to hear his voice, to hold him, but the terms of her agreement left no room for personal desires. Each day, the weight of her secret grew heavier. She feared what Kareem might do if he discovered she had kept something so significant from him. Would he consider it a betrayal? Would it jeopardize her ability to provide for On's future? The door to her room opened slightly, and Amira entered with a tray of tea. "You've been quiet today," she said kindly. Lila forced a smile. "Just thinking." Amira studied her for a moment, but didn't press further. "If you ever need to talk, dear, I'm always here," she offered before leaving. As the door closed, Lila felt a pang of gratitude for the older woman's warmth. But no amount of kindness could ease the turmoil within her. She was living a lie, and sooner or later, she knew the truth would come to light. Kareem's visits to Lila became more frequent, though they remained brief and formal. "Is everything satisfactory?" he asked one morning, standing in the doorway of her room. "Yes," Lila replied, her tone polite but distant. He hesitated before adding, "If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to let me know." It was a simple statement, but something about the way he said it felt different. His voice lacked its usual sharpness, and for a moment his gaze softened. Later that day, Lila ventured back to the gardens. She found Kareem there again, tending to the same delicate plant. This time, she approached without hesitation. "Why is this one so special to you?" she asked, gesturing to the plant. Kareem straightened, brushing soil from his hands. "It belonged to my mother. She used to say caring for it brought her peace." Lila nodded, sensing the pain he carried beneath his composed exterior. "It's beautiful," she said softly. For the first time, Kareem allowed a faint smile to cross his lips. "Yes, it is." As they stood in the quiet garden, an unspoken understanding passed between them. Though their worlds were vastly different, they both carried burdens that had shaped who they were. Lila woke early, her chest heavy with the ache of missing On. She sat by the window, the photograph of her son clutched tightly in her hand. His smile seemed to radiate from the small frame, a reminder of the innocence and love she was fighting for. Unable to bear the silence, she stepped into the mansion's grand library. The towering shelves and ornate furniture should have felt intimidating, but the solitude was oddly comforting. She sank into a chair and opened a book, hoping to distract herself. Minutes later, Kareem entered. His footsteps were quiet, but the sudden presence startled her. "You're up early," he observed, his voice calm. "I couldn't sleep," Lila admitted, closing the book. Kareem's gaze lingered on her for a moment. "Something on your mind?" She hesitated, debating how much to share. "Just thinking about someone I care about," she said carefully. His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "You've made sacrifices to be here," he said, almost to himself. "I hope it's worth it." Before Lila could respond, he left the room. She sat there, wondering if Kareem's words were an acknowledgement of his own sacrifices or simply a passing thought. That evening, Amira informed Lila that Kareem had requested her presence at a formal dinner he was hosting for business associates. "He's asked me to prepare something suitable for you to wear," Amira said with a knowing smile. Lila's nerves fluttered as she dressed in the elegant gown Amira had laid out. Descending the grand staircase, she felt the weight of every gaze on her. Kareem stood at the base, dressed impeccably, his presence commanding the room. As Lila reached him, he extended a hand. "Thank you for joining me," he said, his voice surprisingly warm. Throughout the dinner, Kareem introduced her as his special guest. The label made her feel exposed, and she noticed the subtle glances exchanged among the guests. She tried to focus on the conversation, but the weight of the evening pressed on her. During a quiet moment, Kareem leaned toward her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm trying to adjust," Lila admitted, her honesty surprising even herself. He nodded but said nothing more. For the rest of the evening, he remained close to her, his presence a quiet reassurance amidst the overwhelming atmosphere. The formal dinner had left Lila drained, her mind swirling with doubts about her place in Kareem's world. She returned to her room, kicking off her heels and sinking onto the bed. But sleep wouldn't come. A soft knock at the door startled her. "Come in," she called hesitantly. Kareem stepped inside, his usual composed demeanor replaced by something quieter, almost uncertain. "I wanted to thank you for tonight," he said, his voice softer than usual. Lila blinked in surprise. "You don't need to thank me. I was just following your request." He hesitated, as though weighing his next words. "These events are a formality, but having you there made it easier." His admission caught her off guard. She studied him, noticing the faint shadows under his eyes, the tightness in his jaw. "You seem tired," she said gently. Kareem gave a wry smile. "That's an understatement." He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of vulnerability. "Sometimes, I wonder if all of this is worth it." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Lila wanted to ask more, to peel back the layers of the man who seemed so untouchable. But Kareem straightened abruptly. "Good night, Lila," he said, retreating before she could respond. She watched him go, the brief glimpse of his humanity lingering in her thoughts. The next morning, Lila ventured to the gardens, seeking solace among the flowers and fountains. To her surprise, Kareem was already there, seated on a stone bench with a book in hand. He glanced up as she approached. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, echoing her words from the night before. "No," she admitted, sitting on the bench opposite him. "There's too much on my mind." Kareem closed his book and leaned back, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "The gardens were my mother's sanctuary. She used to say they helped her think." "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman," Lila said softly. "She was," Kareem replied, "but she lived in a world full of expectations, just like I do." Lila hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever wish things were different?" "All the time," he admitted, "but wishing doesn't change anything. Only action does." His words struck a chord with her. For the first time, she felt they shared a common thread, a longing for freedom from the weight of their circumstances. As they sat in companionable silence, Lila realized she was beginning to see Kareem not as an untouchable figure, but as a man with his own struggles, just like her. The quiet morning in the garden lingered in Lila's mind. Kareem's words, his vulnerability, had begun to chip away at the cold, distant figure she'd first met. But it also deepened her fear. How much longer could she hide her secret about On? That evening, Kareem found her in the library, leafing through a book she wasn't really reading. He leaned against the doorway, his arms crossed. "You seem lost in thought." Lila hesitated. "I've just been thinking about someone important to me." "Someone you left behind?" he asked, his tone neutral but probing. She nodded, gripping the edges of the book tightly. "Yes." Kareem stepped closer, his gaze steady. "You've sacrificed a great deal to be here. I won't ask why, but I hope you know it's not something I take lightly." His words sent a pang through her chest. For a moment, she considered telling him everything about On, but the thought of his reaction stopped her. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice quiet. Kareem studied her for a long moment, as though trying to decipher her thoughts, but he didn't press further. Instead, he gave a small nod and left her alone with her racing mind. As days passed, Lila and Kareem's interactions grew more natural. He no longer approached her with the detached formality of their early days, and she found herself speaking more freely in his presence. One afternoon, as they walked through the gardens, Kareem stopped to examine a budding flower. "It's late in blooming this season," he mused, his tone unusually contemplative. "Does it bother you?" Lila asked, curious. "Not really," he replied. "Everything happens in its own time. It just reminds me that even nature doesn't follow strict rules." His comment lingered in Lila's mind as they continued their walk. For a man who thrived on control, his words carried an unexpected openness. Later, as they shared a quiet dinner, Kareem surprised her by asking, "What's your favorite memory from home?" The question caught her off guard, but she smiled faintly. "There's a small park near my apartment." On, she froze, realizing she had said his name. Kareem raised an eyebrow. "On." Lila recovered quickly. "It's nothing, just a name I like." His expression remained neutral, but Lila sensed he wasn't convinced. The slip stayed with her long after the meal, a reminder that her secret was becoming harder to keep. The mansion felt heavier that morning, the kind of quiet that carried an unseen weight. Lila spent her time in the library, flipping through pages without absorbing a word. Her slip about On had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Later, as she returned to her room, she found Kareem standing inside. Her breath caught when she noticed what he was holding, a small photograph of On that she had hidden among her belongings. "Who is this?" Kareem asked, his voice steady but laced with tension. Lila froze. The truth she had been hiding was now laid bare. "That's my son," she admitted, her voice trembling. Kareem's expression darkened. "You lied to me." "I didn't lie," she said quickly, stepping closer. "I didn't tell you because I was afraid. Afraid you'd think I wasn't fit for the contract, that I wouldn't be able to uphold my end of the deal." He crossed his arms, his gaze piercing. "And yet, you agreed to this arrangement knowing you'd be leaving another child behind. Why?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Because I had no choice. We were drowning in debt. On was hungry, and I couldn't bear to see him suffer anymore." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Kareem turned toward the window, his posture rigid. "You should have trusted me," he said quietly. The disappointment in his voice stung more than she expected. She had feared his anger, but this quiet disapproval was far worse. That evening, Kareem summoned Lila to the library. The room was dimly lit, casting long shadows over his features as he sat at the desk. She entered hesitantly, bracing herself for his judgment. "I've reviewed the contract," Kareem began, sliding a folder across the desk toward her. "There's nothing in it about withholding information, but there's also nothing addressing a situation like this." Lila sat down, her hands shaking as she opened the folder. "What does this mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It means we need to renegotiate trust," Kareem said, leaning forward. "I won't send you away, but I can't ignore what you've hidden. This arrangement only works if we're honest moving forward." Lila swallowed hard. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to see on," he said, catching her completely off guard. "But there's a condition. He can't know the truth about this arrangement, not yet." Tears slipped down Lila's cheeks, a mixture of relief and guilt. "Why are you doing this?" Kareem's expression softened slightly. "Because I know what it's like to grow up without answers. I won't let your son suffer for the choices you've made." For the first time, Lila saw a glimmer of compassion in Kareem's eyes, and it both comforted and terrified her. The drive to Sion felt surreal. Lila sat in the back of the limousine, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Kareem sat across from her, silent but watchful, his presence steady yet distant. When they arrived, Lila's heart raced as she stepped out of the car. She spotted On playing in the small courtyard of her elderly neighbor's home. The moment he saw her, his face lit up and he ran to her, arms outstretched. "Mommy," he cried, his small hands gripping her tightly as she knelt to embrace him. Lila held him close, her tears falling freely. "I missed you so much," she whispered. On pulled back slightly, his bright eyes searching hers. "Why did you have to go so far away?" "It's for work," Lila explained, forcing a smile. "But I'll always come back to see you." Kareem stood at a distance, observing the reunion. There was a faint softness in his expression, though he remained composed. As the day went on, Lila and On played together as if no time had passed. When evening came, the goodbye was painful, but Kareem's quiet nod of approval as he opened the car door offered her a sliver of reassurance. Back at the mansion, Lila couldn't shake the emotions of the day. She sat in her room, gazing out at the desert as the sun dipped below the horizon. The knock on her door startled her. Kareem stepped inside, his demeanor calmer than she'd expected. "How was it?" he asked, sitting across from her. "It was wonderful and heartbreaking," she admitted. "He's so young and he doesn't understand why I have to leave him." Kareem nodded, his gaze distant. Children shouldn't have to bear the weight of their parents' choices. But life isn't always fair. There was a pause before Lila spoke. "Thank you for letting me see him. It means more than I can say." Kareem met her eyes, and for a brief moment, the air between them shifted. "You're stronger than you think," he said, his tone softer than usual. The words lingered in Lila's mind long after Kareem left. For the first time, she felt that their connection was beginning to deepen. It wasn't just about obligation anymore. There was something unspoken, fragile yet growing between them. The following days at the mansion felt different. Lila noticed subtle changes in Kareem's demeanor, small gestures that hinted at a softer side. One morning, Amira brought her breakfast to the terrace. Mr. Kareem asked the chef to prepare this. Amira said with a warm smile. He remembered you mentioning how much you missed this dish. Lila stared at the plate, touched by the thoughtfulness. She hadn't expected Kareem to remember such a passing comment. Later that day, as she walked through the library, she noticed a small stack of books on her desk, titles she had casually mentioned in one of their conversations. She ran her fingers over the spines, a faint smile forming. That evening, Kareem joined her at dinner. It was a rare occurrence, and though their conversations remained formal, there was a noticeable shift in his tone. I hope the adjustments to your routine have made things more comfortable, he said. They have, Lila replied, meeting his gaze. Thank you. Kareem nodded, his expression unreadable, but something in his presence felt less guarded, as though he was slowly letting her into his world. One night, unable to sleep, Lila wandered into the music room. The soft glow of the moon illuminated the grand piano in the center of the room. She hesitated, then sat at the bench, her fingers lightly brushing the keys. The sound of footsteps made her turn. Kareem stood in the doorway, his gaze fixed on her. You play? He asked, stepping inside. A little, Lila admitted. My mother taught me when I was young. Kareem approached the piano, his expression softening. My mother taught me as well. He hesitated before sitting beside her. She believed music could heal anything. Lila looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. She sounds like she was an incredible woman. She was, Kareem said quietly. For a moment, the weight of his loss was evident. Lila hesitated, then began to play a simple melody. The soft notes filled the room, creating a moment of quiet intimacy. Kareem watched her, his gaze thoughtful. When she finished, he said softly, Thank you. For what? For reminding me that some things are worth holding on to, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The mansion's gardens had become Lila's refuge. The vibrant blooms and the sound of trickling fountains offered a rare sense of peace. One afternoon, she was wandering among the roses when she found Kareem crouched by a newly planted tree, gently patting the soil around its roots. She approached cautiously, watching him. You take your gardening seriously, she teased lightly. Kareem looked up, a faint smile on his lips. It's one of the few things I can control, he said. Out here, there's no pressure, no expectations, just patience. Lila knelt beside him, brushing her fingers over a leaf. Patience isn't always easy, she murmured. No, it's not, Kareem agreed, his voice softer than usual. But it teaches you to value growth, no matter how slow. The words hung between them, carrying a weight neither needed to explain. They continued to work in silence, the act of nurturing the garden mirroring the quiet bond forming between them. When they stood to leave, Kareem glanced at her. Thank you for joining me. For what? For reminding me that growth doesn't happen alone, he replied before walking away, leaving Lila to ponder his words. The following morning, Kareem invited Lila to join him on a visit to an orphanage he supported. Surprised but curious, she agreed. The children greeted them with bright smiles and laughter. Lila's heart swelled as she watched Kareem interact with them. Gone was the composed, businesslike man she had come to know. In his place was someone patient and kind, crouching to their level as he listened to their stories and helped them with small tasks. One boy tugged on Kareem's sleeve. Do you have kids, Mr. Kareem? Kareem hesitated, glancing at Lila before answering. Not yet, he said softly. Lila noticed the way his expression shifted, as though the question had touched something deep within him. As they left the orphanage, Lila couldn't resist asking, You're different with them. Kareem kept his gaze on the road ahead. Children remind me of what life can be without complications, he said. They see the world simply with hope. I envy that sometimes. The raw honesty in his voice struck Lila. For the first time, she felt she was beginning to understand the man behind the walls. The visit to the orphanage lingered in Lila's mind. Kareem's gentleness with the children, his willingness to show vulnerability, had revealed a side of him she hadn't fully seen before. That evening, she found herself drawn to the library, where Kareem sat reviewing documents. "You're working late," she said softly from the doorway. He glanced up, a hint of a smile crossing his face. "Work doesn't wait." Lila hesitated, then stepped inside. "Do you ever stop to think about what you want? Not for your family, not for the business, but for yourself." Kareem leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I've spent my life fulfilling obligations," he admitted. "Wanting something for myself feels selfish." "Wanting happiness isn't selfish," Lila said, her voice firm. "It's human." He looked at her, his gaze searching. "And what do you want, Lila?" "Truly," she hesitated, her heart pounding. "To give my son a better life. To not feel like I'm constantly failing him." Kareem's expression softened and he nodded slowly. "Then we're not so different after all." Their conversation lingered long after she left, the honesty of their words drawing them closer in ways neither had anticipated. A week later, Kareem called Lila to his office. When she entered, she found him standing by the window, the contract that had governed their arrangement spread out on the desk. "I've been thinking about this," he began without turning. "About the terms we agreed on." Lila's stomach tightened. "What about them?" Kareem faced her, his expression calm but serious. "They no longer feel right." "What are you saying?" she asked cautiously. He gestured to the document. "I'm making changes. You'll be allowed to maintain contact with On, no matter what happens after the baby is born. I want to ensure he remains a part of your life." Lila stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I've seen what you're willing to sacrifice for him," Kareem said simply. "And because I believe trust is something we need to rebuild." Tears welled in Lila's eyes as she whispered, "Thank you." Kareem nodded, a faint smile softening his expression. "It's not a favor, Lila. It's what's right." In that moment, she realized that the man she had once feared might be capable of more compassion than she'd ever imagined. Kareem surprised Lila one morning by asking her to join him and on a trip outside the mansion. "It's time we spend some time together as a family," he said, his tone unusually light. The car ride was filled with On's excited chatter. Lila couldn't help but smile at the way he peppered Kareem with questions. To her surprise, Kareem answered each one patiently, even laughing at On's more outlandish ideas. They arrived at a quiet retreat on the edge of the desert, where gardens blended seamlessly with the natural landscape. On ran ahead, his laughter echoing through the air. Lila and Kareem followed, their steps slower, more deliberate. "He seems happy," Kareem remarked, watching On chase a butterfly. "He is," Lila replied, her voice tinged with emotion. "Thank you for letting him have this." Kareem glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "It's not just for him. It's for us too." For the rest of the day, they shared moments of simplicity, playing with On, walking through the gardens, and talking about things that didn't feel so heavy. It was a glimpse of what life could be, and for the first time, Lila allowed herself to hope. The weeks passed, and Lila's pregnancy became more evident. The staff adjusted their routines to ensure she was comfortable, and Amira was always nearby with advice or an encouraging word. Kareem, too, seemed to take a more active role. He often checked on her, asking about her health and offering to join her during her evening walks in the gardens. "You don't have to do this," Lila said one evening as they strolled beneath the fading sunlight. "Do what?" Kareem asked. "Pretend you care," she replied softly, though her words lacked bitterness. Kareem stopped walking and turned to her. "I'm not pretending," he said firmly. "I care about the child, yes, but I also care about you. This arrangement started as a transaction, but it's become more than that for me." Lila stared at him, her emotions swirling. She wanted to believe him, but doubt lingered. "It's hard to trust that after everything." "I know," Kareem admitted, his voice low. "But I'm willing to prove it, if you'll let me." Lila nodded, unsure of what to say. They continued walking, the silence between them no longer heavy, but full of unspoken possibilities. Despite the calm growing within the mansion, outside forces began to stir. Kareem's extended family, still influential in his life, had taken note of the changes in him. They saw his softer demeanor and the attention he gave to Lila and her son as distractions from his responsibilities. One afternoon, Kareem received an unexpected visit from his uncle, a stern man who had been instrumental in shaping Kareem's business acumen. They met in the study, where the air quickly grew tense. "This arrangement of yours," his uncle began, his voice sharp, "is becoming a liability." Kareem remained composed. "It's my life, and my decisions are my own." "Your decisions affect the family," the older man retorted. "This woman, her son, they don't belong in our world. You have obligations, Kareem. Don't let sentiment blind you." The words stung, but Kareem stood his ground. "I understand my obligations, but they don't define me. What I'm building here is mine, and it will not be dictated by others." The conversation ended with an uneasy truce, but Kareem knew the battle was far from over. That evening, he shared none of the encounter with Lila, instead choosing to focus on the fragile peace they were creating together. A few days later, Kareem found Lila in the gardens. She was sitting beneath a flowering tree, her hands resting protectively on her growing belly. The sight stirred something deep within him, a mixture of admiration and guilt for the way their relationship had started. He approached quietly and she looked up, her expression softening. "You look like you have something on your mind," she said. Kareem sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I've been thinking about us, about everything that's happened since you came here." Lila's heart quickened. "And what have you decided?" He turned to face her, his expression open, vulnerable. "I want this to be more than a contract. I want us to try to build something real. Together." The weight of his words hung in the air. Lila searched his face, looking for any sign of insincerity, but found none. "That's not a small thing to ask," she said quietly. "I know," Kareem replied, "and I'm willing to prove that I mean it. But I can't do this without you." Lila felt a mixture of hope and fear. She wanted to believe him, to trust in the possibility of a future together, but the scars of her past held her back. "I need time," she finally said. "You'll have it," Kareem promised. "As much as you need." For the first time, Lila felt the walls around her heart begin to crack. Lila awoke in the middle of the night to a sharp pain in her abdomen. At first, she thought it might be another false alarm, but the intensity quickly increased. Gritting her teeth, she called out, and within moments, Amira was by her side. "You're in labor," Amira said urgently, helping Lila sit up. "I'll get Mr. Kareem." Lila's breaths came in shallow gasps as the staff rushed to prepare for the hospital. Kareem appeared at her door moments later, his usually composed demeanor replaced with genuine concern. "It's time," he said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "We're going now." The ride to the hospital was tense. Kareem sat beside Lila, his hand gripping hers as he murmured words of reassurance. When they arrived, the medical team whisked her away, leaving Kareem to pace anxiously in the waiting room. Hours later, the sound of a baby's cry broke the silence. Kareem was called into the room, where he found Lila cradling their newborn son. Her face was pale with exhaustion, but her eyes shone with love as she looked up at him. "He's beautiful," Kareem said softly, his voice breaking. He reached out to touch the baby's tiny hand, overwhelmed by a wave of emotions he hadn't expected. In that moment, the magnitude of their journey hit them both. They were no longer bound by a contract. They were bound by the fragile, precious life they had created together. The first days back at the mansion were a whirlwind. The baby, whom they named Adam, quickly became the center of everyone's attention. Amira and the staff doted on him, and Kareem seemed to spend every free moment by his side. One afternoon, as Lila sat in the nursery feeding Adam, Kareem entered quietly. He stood by the door, watching them with an expression she couldn't quite place. "Is everything okay?" she asked. He nodded, stepping closer. "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next," he said, his tone serious. Lila raised an eyebrow, and Kareem pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "This contract, it doesn't matter anymore." He unfolded the document, showing her the terms they had both agreed to months ago. Without hesitation, he tore it in half, then into smaller pieces, letting them fall to the floor. "Kareem," Lila whispered, stunned. "I don't want this to define us anymore," he said, sitting beside her. "You, Adam, you're my family now, and I want us to move forward, not as part of an arrangement, but because we choose this together." Lila's heart swelled, tears streaming down her face as she nodded. "I want that too." Kareem reached for her hand, and for the first time, Lila felt that their future was no longer something to fear. It was something to embrace. The days following Kareem's bold gesture brought a new rhythm to the mansion. The air felt lighter, and for the first time, Lila allowed herself to envision a future not defined by fear or obligation. One evening, Kareem invited her to the garden after dinner. The moon cast a soft glow over the carefully tended flowers, and the air was fragrant with the scent of jasmine. "I thought you might enjoy some fresh air," Kareem said, his voice calm but tinged with something Lila couldn't quite place. As they walked, he seemed quieter than usual, his hands tucked into his pockets. Finally, they stopped by a fountain, its gentle trickle the only sound breaking the stillness. Kareem turned to her, his expression uncharacteristically uncertain. "Lila, there's something I need to say." She watched him, her heart pounding. "What is it?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a delicate diamond ring. "I didn't expect this when we started," he began. "But you've shown me a life I didn't know I needed. A life I want to share with you. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Lila's eyes as she stared at the ring, her emotions overwhelming. "Yes," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Yes, I will." Kareem slid the ring onto her finger, his smile breaking through his usual composure. They embraced, and for the first time, Lila felt truly safe in his arms. The mansion buzzed with activity as preparations for the wedding began. Kareem insisted on a ceremony that reflected both of their cultures, ensuring that Lila felt as much at home in the celebration as he did. Lila worked closely with Amira to choose decorations, blending traditional Arabic elements with touches from her own upbringing. Every detail felt personal, from the flowers in the garden to the delicate gold accents on the invitations. Thrilled by the excitement, eagerly helped where he could. He ran through the halls with a small clipboard, declaring himself the boss of decorations, much to everyone's amusement. One afternoon, as Lila stood in the garden reviewing the seating arrangements, Kareem approached her. "You've been working hard," he said, his voice warm. "It's important to me," Lila replied, smiling. "I want this day to be perfect." Kareem reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "It will be, because we'll be together." The preparations brought the mansion to life in ways it had never been before, filling it with laughter, anticipation, and the promise of a beautiful future. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and warm, with sunlight spilling over the lush gardens that had been transformed into a breathtaking venue. Every detail shimmered with the careful blend of Arabic elegance and personal touches that Lila and Kareem had chosen together. Lila stood in her room, gazing at her reflection in the mirror. Her gown was a masterpiece, white with gold embroidery that glimmered under the soft light. Amira stood nearby, her eyes misty. "You look stunning, my dear," Amira said, adjusting the veil. Lila smiled nervously, her heart racing. "I never imagined this would be my life." Outside, Kareem waited near the altar, dressed in a traditional suit that reflected his heritage. He exuded calm confidence, but his fingers fidgeted slightly. When An appeared by his side, holding the wedding rings with an enormous grin, Kareem's tension melted into a warm smile. As Lila walked down the aisle, her eyes met Kareem's, and the world seemed to fade. Every step felt surreal, a journey from uncertainty into hope. "You look breathtaking," Kareem whispered as he took her hands. The vows were simple but heartfelt, promises of love, respect, and unity. As Kareem kissed Lila, the gathered guests erupted into applause, the sound echoing across the gardens and into the bright future they had pledged to build together. The reception was a joyful fusion of cultures, with traditional Arabic music blending seamlessly with melodies from Lila's homeland. Guests danced, laughed, and feasted under the starlit sky, the garden lit with delicate lanterns. On darted between tables, proudly showing off the rings he had carried, earning chuckles and warm smiles from everyone. Lila watched him, her heart full as Kareem approached with 2 glasses of sparkling juice. "To new beginnings," he said, handing her a glass. "To love," Lila replied, clinking her glass with his. The couple shared their first dance, moving gracefully to a soft tune that seemed to encapsulate their journey, filled with trials but ultimately leading to joy. As the night wore on, Kareem surprised Lila by taking the microphone and addressing their guests. "Thank you for being here to celebrate with us," he began, his voice steady. "This day is more than a wedding. It's the start of a family, a life built on trust, sacrifice, and love. And for that, I'm endlessly grateful." Lila's eyes filled with tears as Kareem stepped down and pulled her into his arms. "I meant every word," he whispered, and she believed him completely. Life at the mansion settled into a new rhythm after the wedding. The once quiet halls were now filled with laughter, the patter of On's energetic footsteps, and the gentle coos of baby Adam. Kareem took to fatherhood with surprising ease. He spent mornings in the nursery, holding Adam and marveling at the tiny life in his arms. On often joined him, eagerly sharing stories with his baby brother, who gazed up at him in wide-eyed wonder. One afternoon, Kareem found Lila in the garden, sitting on a bench and watching On chase butterflies. He sat beside her, their hands naturally finding each other. "You've brought so much life to this place," Kareem said softly. "You've done the same for me," Lila replied, resting her head on his shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children. For the first time, the mansion didn't feel like a monument to wealth and power. It felt like home. One evening, as the children slept, Kareem led Lila to the music room. He opened a drawer and pulled out a worn journal. "This belonged to my mother," he said, handing it to her. Lila carefully opened the journal, her fingers tracing the elegant handwriting. The pages were filled with thoughts, dreams, and reflections about Kareem's childhood. "She used to write about the life she wanted for me," Kareem said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But after she passed, my father's expectations took over. I lost sight of who I wanted to be." Lila placed a hand on his arm. "She would be proud of the man you've become. You're creating a life she would have loved." Kareem smiled faintly. "It's because of you. You've helped me remember what matters." They spent the rest of the evening reading the journal, the words a bridge between Kareem's past and the future they were building together. Kareem's relationship with On had grown naturally, but one afternoon marked a significant turning point. The two were in the study, where Kareem had set up a small chessboard. On watched intently as Kareem explained the rules, his small hands eagerly moving the pieces. "Why does the king move so slowly?" On asked, furrowing his brow. Kareem smiled. "Because the king needs to think carefully. He has to protect everyone else." On nodded seriously, then made his move. "Checkmate," he declared triumphantly, his face lighting up. Kareem laughed, genuinely impressed. "You're a fast learner." Later, Lila found him in the garden, where Kareem was helping On climb a small tree. "Careful," she called, but Kareem looked back with a reassuring smile. "He's fine," Kareem said, steadying On. "I'm right here." Watching them together, Lila felt a deep sense of gratitude. Kareem wasn't just a provider. He was becoming a father figure On could rely on. One evening, after putting the children to bed, Kareem and Lila sat on the balcony, gazing at the desert sky. The stars were bright, the air cool and calm. "We've come a long way," Lila said softly. Kareem nodded. But there's still more to build. He turned to her, his expression thoughtful. I want us to decide together, what kind of future do we want for our family? Lila smiled, resting her hand on his. A future where we all feel safe and loved, where the children grow up knowing they can be anything they want. Kareem's gaze softened. I want that too. And I want them to understand the importance of kindness, like you've taught me. They talked late into the night, sharing dreams and hopes. For the first time, their plans felt limitless, rooted in a love that had grown stronger than either had imagined. The quiet hum of the mansion was amplified by the evening stillness. The children were tucked into bed, their laughter and play now replaced by the soft murmur of the wind brushing against the tall windows. Lila found herself in the library, a room that had become a space of solace for her. The soft, golden glow of the fire danced across the bookshelves, casting flickering shadows on the intricate woodwork. She had a book open in her lap, but her eyes drifted from the words on the page to the flames. Her mind was elsewhere, lingering on the events of the past few months. So much had changed since that fateful night in the auction hall. The fear, the sacrifice, and the uncertainty that had gripped her then felt like distant echoes compared to the warmth she now felt in her heart. The sound of footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Kareem standing at the doorway, his silhouette framed by the light from the hall. He was dressed in casual yet impeccably tailored clothes, his tie undone and his sleeves rolled up, a rare sight that made him seem more approachable, more human. "May I join you?" he asked, his voice soft. Yet there was something in his tone that made her heart skip a beat. "Of course," Lila said, closing her book and setting it aside. Kareem crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled, filling the silence, and the tension between them felt almost tangible. "You seem lost in thought," Kareem said finally, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. His piercing gaze met hers, and Lila felt exposed, as though he could see everything she was trying to process. "I suppose I am," she admitted, folding her hands in her lap. "There's just a lot to think about." Kareem nodded slowly, his expression contemplative. "I know the feeling." He looked away briefly, his eyes tracing the patterns in the flames. "Lila," he began, his voice quieter now, "there's something I've been meaning to say." She straightened, sensing the gravity of his words. "What is it?" Kareem leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped in front of him. For the first time, Lila saw a flicker of uncertainty in his demeanor, a vulnerability that caught her off guard. "When this all began," he said, his gaze still on the fire, "I told myself it was just a contract, a means to an end. I needed an heir, and you needed a way out of your situation." He paused, his jaw tightening. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about that. Lila's breath caught, but she remained silent, allowing him to continue. "You've shown me things I didn't think I was capable of feeling," Kareem said, finally looking at her. His dark eyes held a depth she hadn't seen before. "When I look at you, I see strength, compassion, and a love that goes beyond words. You've given me something I didn't even realize I was missing, a sense of purpose that's more than just duty or legacy." Lila felt her throat tighten as tears pricked at her eyes. "I love you, Lila," Kareem said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "And I don't just mean as a mother of my child or as someone I admire. I love you for who you are, for everything you've endured and everything you've given." The room seemed to hold its breath. Lila stared at him, her heart racing. She had spent so long guarding herself, protecting her emotions, that hearing these words felt like the final breaking of a dam. "Kareem," she began, her voice trembling. She paused, gathering herself. "I never thought I'd hear those words from you, and I never thought I'd feel this way about anyone again. But you've shown me that it's possible to trust, to let go of fear." She met his gaze, her tears falling freely now. "I love you too." The words hung between them, a declaration that felt both fragile and powerful. Kareem stood and crossed the room, kneeling in front of her. He reached for her hands, holding them gently as if she were something precious. "I promise you, Lila," he said, his voice low but full of conviction. "I will spend the rest of my life showing you what those words mean to me. You'll never have to doubt them." Lila smiled through her tears, her heart full. "And I'll do the same for you." Kareem leaned forward, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. The firelight danced around them, casting their entwined shadows on the wall. In that moment, the weight of their past felt lighter, replaced by the promise of a future built on love and understanding. The mansion felt alive with celebration. Soft, golden lights lined the garden pathways, and the faint scent of blooming jasmine mingled with the cool desert breeze. The night sky stretched endlessly above, stars twinkling like tiny diamonds against the inky black canvas. Laughter and the sound of children playing echoed across the grounds, filling the space with warmth and joy. Lila stood at the edge of the terrace, gazing out at the garden where guests mingled. She was dressed in a flowing cream-colored gown that shimmered softly in the moonlight, its design a blend of her culture and Kareem's heritage. The hem swayed gently as the breeze caught it, brushing against her ankles. Behind her, Kareem approached silently, his presence strong yet comforting. He placed a hand on her shoulder, and she turned to meet his gaze. He was dressed in an elegant yet understated suit, the crisp lines emphasizing his refined demeanor. "You look stunning," Kareem said, his voice low and sincere. Lila smiled, a blush creeping across her cheeks. "You don't look too bad yourself." They shared a quiet moment, the sounds of the celebration fading into the background. Kareem's hand slid down her arm, intertwining his fingers with hers. "How does it feel?" he asked. "What? To finally have everything you deserve." Lila's gaze softened as she turned her eyes back to the garden. "It feels surreal. I never thought life could look like this." Kareem followed her gaze, watching on dart between tables, laughing as he chased after a smaller boy, his younger brother Adam. The sight stirred something deep within him, a sense of fulfillment that no wealth or power had ever brought. "This," Kareem said, gesturing toward the children, the guests, the home they had built, "is only the beginning." As the evening progressed, Lila and Kareem joined their guests in the garden. Amira was bustling about, ensuring everyone was comfortable, her warm smile lighting up the crowd. Lila approached her with gratitude. "You've outdone yourself, Amira," Lila said, hugging her tightly. "Oh, nonsense," Amira replied, her eyes twinkling. "This is your night. It's my joy to see this family so full of life." Kareem watched the exchange from a short distance, his expression soft. He had grown to admire the bond between Lila and Amira, seeing how the older woman had become both a guide and a friend to her. On ran up to Kareem, tugging at his hand. "Come play with us, Baba," he exclaimed, using the affectionate term for father that had slowly become natural for him. Kareem's chest tightened at the sound. He crouched down to On's level, a smile breaking through his usual composed demeanor. "What are we playing?" "Talk," On shouted, already pulling him toward the grass. Lila laughed as she watched Kareem, the once imposing billionaire, run around the garden with two children in tow. Adam toddled after them, his giggles carrying through the night. "You softened him," Amira whispered, standing beside Lila. "Maybe," Lila replied, her smile widening. "Or maybe this was who he was all along, waiting for the right moment to show it." As the night wore on, the crowd began to thin, leaving only close friends and family. Kareem gathered everyone near the center of the garden, where a small stage had been set up. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Kareem began, his voice carrying easily over the quiet murmurs of the guests. He held a glass in his hand, but his focus was entirely on Lila, who stood a few steps away, holding Adam. "This evening isn't just a celebration of what we've built," Kareem continued, his tone steady but filled with emotion. "It's a celebration of love, of resilience, and of second chances." Lila has shown me that life is more than duty or ambition. She has taught me what it means to care, to give, and to truly live. Lila's eyes glistened with unshed tears as Kareem turned fully toward her. To you, Lila, he said, lifting his glass, for being the light that guided me through the darkness, and for giving me a family I didn't know I needed. I promise to always stand by your side, no matter what the future holds. The crowd erupted into applause, but Lila barely heard it. Her world narrowed to Kareem and the sincerity in his gaze. The final act of the evening began with a loud crackle that drew everyone's eyes to the sky. Fireworks exploded in bursts of color, lighting up the desert night with vibrant reds, blues, and golds. The children squealed in delight, craning their necks to watch the display. Lila and Kareem stood side by side, their hands intertwined. On leaned against Kareem's leg, and Adam clutched Lila's shoulder, his tiny fist grasping her dress as he gaped at the lights above. "It's beautiful," Lila whispered, her voice full of wonder. "Not as beautiful as this moment," Kareem replied, pulling her closer. As the final fireworks faded into a cascade of golden sparks, Lila rested her head on Kareem's shoulder. Together, they stood as a family, the weight of their journey behind them and the promise of a brighter future ahead. When the guests had left and the children were fast asleep, Lila and Kareem returned to the terrace, where the faint glow of the fire pit kept the night chill at bay. They sat side by side on a cushioned bench, the silence between them comfortable and serene. "Did you ever imagine your life would look like this?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kareem shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "Not in my wildest dreams. And yet, I can't imagine it any other way now." Lila reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. "Neither can I." As they sat beneath the vast desert sky, their hearts full and their spirits at peace, they knew that their journey, though marked by hardship and sacrifice, had led them exactly where they were meant to be. Enjoy the story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care.